Now at this point, Socrates turns to the tyrannical soul. Not only the soul of the tyrant, but keep in mind there is an analogy going here between the state and the soul. And so, as a democratic state represents in some way the externalization of a democratic soul, so a tyrannical state exemplifies a kind of tyrannical soul. Now, what is such a soul like? Socrates, well, Plato, devotes all of Book 9 to investigating the tyrannical soul. And it's absolutely fundamental to the overall argument of the Republic, because the argument is that it profits you to be just, that being unjust actually is a worse way to live. You might think that being unjust, and in effect getting away with it, would make your life better. But Plato says it's not true. And why not? Because you end up being a tyrant. On the inside, as well as on the outside, you end up with a tyrannical soul. And it's not a good kind of soul to have. Not only from a moral point of view, it is not a happy soul. It is someone who feels torn apart and tortured from within. And Book 9 is devoted to explaining how that's true. Now here, I just want to give the most general outline of it. There's a lot of psychological insight going on, I think, in Book 9, explaining the psychology of such a person. Socrates begins by talking about different kinds of desires. After all, one of the parts of the soul is the appetitive part, the part that generates our desires, our wants. And so he says, you've got to understand, there are different kinds of desires. There are different kinds of wants and appetites. Some of them are absolutely lawful and necessary. After all, we need food, for example. We need water in order to live. These things are absolutely natural desires. We seek shelter. We want various things that are vital to living and living well. And so those things are necessary. There's nothing wrong with desiring them. Now, there's still a limit. We shouldn't desire food and drink and other things excessively. Nevertheless, the desire for these things is perfectly normal, and nothing wrong with any of that. There are other desires, he says, that are not necessary, but nevertheless perfectly acceptable. There's nothing wrong with them. I am fond, for example, of t-shirts like this one, WKRP in Cincinnati, the first annual turkey drop. Well, that's a reference to a TV show I loved many years ago. And yeah, I have a fondness for t-shirts with silly messages like this. But hey, it's not necessary. I mean, I don't need such t-shirts. On the other hand, there's nothing particularly wrong with them. There is a third class of desires, however, Plato says, that is, well, really to be avoided. Those are lawless desires. They are highly destructive desires. Those are the desires that we have to stay away from and very carefully monitor. He describes these desires as terrible, fierce, and lawless. Now, they require very careful restraint by the rational and the spirited elements of the soul. These kinds of desires might be thought of as cravings, as lusts, as things that really go beyond proper bounds and have to be very carefully restrained. Now, maybe we should, maybe we can eliminate altogether some of these. Some of them maybe we can't really eliminate, but they have to be very carefully guarded against by the rational and spirited elements. Emotion and reason really have to be very careful about restraining these lawless desires and pushing them into a more lawful form. Now here I don't just mean lawful in the sense of legal and illegal, or even exactly moral and immoral. Some of these are highly destructive, and they have to be suppressed or channeled into non-destructive directions. In any case, these are highly dangerous desires, and those are the ones that the tyrannical person tends to allow free rein within his soul. Part of this comes about as a result of democracy's tendency to value liberty and equality. Liberty, the freedom to do things, and it increasingly becomes license, a freedom to do things without restraint. Also, the equality, we start declining to draw distinctions between good desires and bad desires, helpful desires and destructive desires, helpful ways of living, constructive ways of living, and destructive ways of living. And insofar as things are permitted and then treated as equally as good as those that are in fact much better than them, we are actually encouraging these highly destructive desires. In the tyrannical soul, they end up not being impeded by reason and emotion, but instead running rampant. The result of that is that the tyrannical soul ends up being dominated by these lawless, by these highly destructive and damaging desires. Now, if in the state there are a few people with tyrannical souls, they tend to become criminals. They become outlaws, and they deviate from the patterns of the society at large, but at least there are few enough that they're recognized as social deviants who are departing from the norms that govern the society. If there are a lot of them, however, it's no longer a large criminal element. The moral breakdown of the society begins in an earnest way. And the result of all that is a kind of collapse of norms within the society at large. That's the condition that produces a tyrant. So the tyrannical soul in isolation is a bad thing for the person who has it. And if there are a few of them, they become criminal elements. If there are a lot of them, though, they exert real power in the state. They start destroying the norms of the state, and that is fertile ground for one of them to become this tyrannical leader. So the result of that is that not only is the soul dominated by these lawless and destructive desires, the society becomes dominated by lawless and destructive desires, lawless and destructive patterns of behavior. The result of that, Plato says, is terrible. There is no city more wretched than that in which a tyrant rules, he says. Analogously, the tyrannical soul is miserable. The most reasonable parts of it being enslaved, while a small part, the worst and most frenzied, plays the despot. Such a soul does not do what it wishes, but suffers from unfulfilled desire. Basically, these lawless and destructive desires can't be satisfied. You want more and more and more. The soul may want wealth and power, but it's never enough. It's never enough wealth. It's never enough power. I've wondered sometimes how people who have hundreds of millions of dollars, even billions of dollars, keep doing things that are, in many cases, highly immoral in order to obtain more. What's the point of attaining more? You're already rich. You can't possibly spend all that money during the rest of your life. What are you doing? What are you looking for? I think the answer is, first of all, there's no limit to these desires. Getting a certain amount just makes them want more. It is a highly destructive sort of obsessive desire. The other thing is, well, money can be turned into power. You may not be able to spend all that money during your lifetime, but maybe you can accumulate more and more power. But can you really use that power during your lifetime? Don't you, in effect, have to delegate a lot of that power to other people, and then, well, it's really out of your control? I don't know. I don't really understand from the inside a tyrannical soul. But I certainly observe a lot of them around. And Plato's observing them too. After all, he's lived through democracy in Athens. He's lived through the era of the 30 tyrants. He has observed tens of thousands of his fellow Athenians being put to death by the tyrants or being driven into exile. And so he knows this firsthand. And he's saying, look, I know what's going on with these people. No matter how much they have, they want more. No matter how much power, no matter how much wealth, no matter how much pleasure-seeking they manage to attain, it's never enough. There is a constant thirst for more. And so these desires are really unfulfillable. No matter how much you have, it's a desire for more. A desire for more. And consequently, that desire can never be satisfied. As a result, the tyrannical soul is utterly unguided by reason. It is battered by the worst possible desires. It ends up being controlled, driven, enslaved to the lowest and most illusory pleasures. The highest pleasures, Plato says, are those of the rational part of the soul, of insight, of understanding, of reason. The next best are those of the spirited element, those involved in emotion, love, compassion, friendship, other things that are noble expressions of our natures. But the worst of our desires, that's what dominates in the tyrannical soul. And those desires end up controlling and enslaving the tyrannical soul. The tyrant is not master of his domain. He is in fact slave of the things inside him that are unquenchable. Socrates ends up saying the soul is like a shell. It contains a man, reason, the rational element. It contains a lion, emotion, the spirited element. But it also contains a many-headed beast. That's the appetitive element, desire. An unjust person who appears to be just is like a shell that looks human, but with the many-headed beast and lion within, fighting with each other and destroying the man inside. So far from being better off than the person who is just but is thought of as being unjust, the person who is unjust but thought of as being just may enjoy all sorts of rewards externally, but is torn apart internally, is in fact being destroyed by that many-headed beast, the internal, lawless, and destructive, unquenchable desires. The just person is like a shell with the man inside in control, taming the lion and the beast, making them friendly to each other and to himself. Now, if we adopt a different analogy, the idea is this: the unjust man who wins external rewards is like somebody who sells himself, somebody who enslaves himself, becomes a slave to the worst elements of his own nature. On the other hand, the wise man will keep his eyes fixed on the constitution in his soul, seeking pleasures only to the extent that they make him a better man. So the idea, in the end, I think comes down to this: are you the master of your desires, or are your desires the masters of you? Forget the external part for a moment. What really matters to whether you are better off, what really matters, and here he means not just morally speaking, but prudentially, what makes you better off, what makes you happier? Is it being well-ordered inside and being the master of your emotions and your desires? Or is it having the worst of your desires in control of you, being enslaved by these desires that cannot be satisfied, that cannot be quenched, that are highly destructive to the person you are within? Plato says, I'd rather be the just person, thought to be unjust, than such a person enslaved to the very worst things inside of me.